Aloha, I'm Michael Thomas Fumai, composer in residence and director of artistic engagement for the Hawaii Symphony Orchestra. Welcome to Concert Conversations for our Halekulani Masterworks performance of Tchaikovsky's Pathetique, a program that includes works by Peter Lieberson and Cesar Franck. Joining me on stage today is music and artistic director Dane Lam.
Hi, thank you. Aloha, everybody.
And our distinguished guest artist this afternoon is Mezzo Soprano Fleur Barron.
Thank you. Aloha. Thank you.
Fleur Barron makes her debut with us at the HSO this afternoon. But Fleur, this is not your first time to Hawaii.
No, I was on this island it wasn't this time last year, but about a year ago or so, and just for a few days, and absolutely loved it. And it's just so nice to be here now. And after this, I then embark on 1 month holidays. My mom is here. Today we're going to visit her family in Singapore and some family in other places as well. So it's very nice to be here with you all.
Maestro, as all of your programs do, there is a running theme that tie together all of the works that are performed. And here at the end of the year, December, there is something that also ties this program together, and that is the connection of love and loss, and no better displayed here than by Peter Lieberson's Neruda Songs, which, Fleur, you will perform. It is a 5-song cycle, but there's a very compelling story behind its creation, a love story.
Yeah, so the composer Peter Lieberson, who passed away from lymphoma, I think in 2011, wrote this cycle for his wife, Lorraine Hunt Lieberson, who sadly passed away from cancer in 2006. And this cycle of essentially love songs, they're about love, but they're about the complexities of being in love and being human, also about grief. And they were the last things that she performed before she died, and the last cycle that he wrote for her. So they're very poignant. They were poignant then, and they continue to be poignant. Also because Neruda's poems are so touching. The texts are in Spanish, and they're very simple, but full of very vivid imagery, nature imagery, and all kinds of things to describe love. These pieces, this is Dane, and this is our first time collaborating, and we've been thinking for a while, what would be a great first project to do together, and I was so overjoyed when Dane suggested this cycle, because this has been on my bucket list for a very long time, in part because the singer, Lorraine Hunt Lieberson, for whom they were written, is kind of my mezzo idol. I mean, she was just such a special artist. So I feel it's very big shoes that I have to fill by doing these. But the music is so, it's very spiritual, actually. It's sort of transcendent music. It's full of love and also full of dance rhythms, which is kind of a unique quality of the piece, that even across these 5 songs, some of which are perhaps lighter in mood and some a little bit darker, this kind of pulse, this rhythmic pulse, carries you through. And then the closing metaphor is about how, well, if one of us happens to die first, let's not worry about that, because love is like an endless river and we will meet again. And so with this kind of dance pulse throughout the whole cycle, we really feel the sincerity of that closing image of the entire cycle.
Dane, this will be your first time performing this work. I'm curious, how did you find this piece?
I've wanted to do these Neruda songs for, the better part of 2 decades, actually, because I was a student in New York when, just shortly after they were premiered, actually, and I heard them, and I also heard the story behind them, and I thought, I've got to perform this, and I've been trying for years and years, well, almost 2 decades, really, and finally have had the chance to perform them, and they're really extraordinary. As Fleur was saying, the poetry is incredibly poignant, and it's touching in such a sincere way, but it's somehow allied to the music in a very authentic manner as well. It's written for not a massive orchestra. It's I would say it's written for a chamber orchestra, but the scoring of it, the orchestration, is done in such a beautiful, colourful way, where strands of instrumental colour are just passed around, just little dabs here of a red or a green, and it all sort of congeals into this beautiful, beautiful painting of what love might mean and how allied love and loss really are. The harmonic language of the piece I find really interesting, and Fleur and I were talking about this because, when I sit down well, for anything, but especially to work with a singer, I'll sit down and sort of play the piano very badly and try to sing it and try to sing the right pitches. And in this one, it on first listening, it seems, well, it is tonal, sort of, but it takes so many incongruous and unexpected twists and turns that it's just enough to keep us guessing and giving us this feeling of familiarity and also some kind of, distance is not the right word, but I guess this is the best thing about music. It's very hard to put into words. This harmony gives us some familiarity, but a certain exoticness to it, I suppose. I can't think of very good words.
And also complexity, I think, because, sometimes songs about love or poems about love can be a little, perhaps sentimental or a little tweak, and especially if you've got 30 minutes, the cycle is 30 minutes long. And, when I was first learning these, I thought, oh, goodness, these are harder than I thought, because I had heard the recording, and they're kind of, for a 20th century composer who was a major figure in the scene, they're kind of unapologetically tonal and romantic and sumptuous in a way that we don't tend to associate with kind of modern music, let's say, or contemporary music. And but what I love is that the chromaticism and the kind of wherever we start, let's say a phrase or a motif, it goes in a totally unexpected direction harmonically. And I think that brings a lot of depth and, complexity to what in Neruda's poem might be quite a simple line of text. And I think that very much reflects how relationships are. That, love is definitely not a kind of monochromatic feeling and experience.
It's like life, really. It's like life. So you can experience all of life in these Lieberson Neruda songs. It's going to be a real treat. And I think it's the Hawaii premiere.
I believe it is. Today's concert is dedicated to the memory of Michael Titterton, our longtime board member and former president, who also led Hawaii Public Radio. It was through HPR that I was first introduced to the Neruda songs. And when I first heard them, I recalled a similar experience of hearing Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings for the first time, in that it is music that very much makes one aware of yourself, of who you are. And so it is music that I think speaks to a truth that is in the beholder of the listener. Now, Fleur, you have a very interesting origin story, one that involves musicals?
So I grew up in Hong Kong, and I was listening to a lot of American musical theater, and we moved to New York when I was in high school, and it went to a lot of Broadway shows, and I thought, oh, that's really what I want to do. This music is so great, it was so visceral, really fun, and so I started taking some Broadway-style voice lessons. I think I was about 16 or 17. And, I had a natural voice, but I certainly was not, didn't have lots of vibrato. I wasn't a sort of obvious opera singer or something at that stage. And my teacher, after 6 months, she said, oh, honey, you're not a Broadway singer, you're an opera singer. And I just remember feeling depressed, actually. I was like, oh, well, I don't like opera, and what does that mean? And she was like, well, I've also got to be honest, you're not a great dancer, so I really don't know if you're going to have a career on Broadway. And I was like, oh, okay. This kind of, everything just kind of collapsed inwardly. But I think maybe American musical theater was my entry point into loving vocal music. And my parents were big classical music buffs and opera buffs, and of course, after we moved to New York, they took me to the Met and other things, and I was it was a slow burn. It wasn't love at first sight, but eventually I did come around, because I stayed in New York City for college, I went to Columbia and didn't study music, but I did start to go a lot to different musical offerings with my friends. And I think somehow when you go with your friends, it's a different experience than with your parents, maybe, at least for classical music in my case. So that's my origin story.
And now you are curating programs that tell stories that are not being told, but need to be told. What are the stories that speak to you most strongly?
The shape my career has taken, which is very different than what you're, when you're studying in school, and when start to become aware of like professional paths and what they could look like. I really wasn't too cognizant of curating and what that means, or the kind of broad spectrum of what it could mean to be an artist. I was just very much focused on trying to get my technique together and I guess do opera because that's what everyone seems to do. And I'm very fortunate that somehow over the last, 6 years, maybe something like that, I do opera, I also do symphonic things like this, and I do a lot of chamber music. And the curating is kind of an intrinsic part of doing recitals because it's just you and a piano, or maybe you and a string quartet. It's a much smaller ensemble. And so the process of programming is very collaborative, and it's great because in that capacity, I have the opportunity to choose my repertoire and also sequence things in a way that I don't get to do when I'm in an opera production, for example. And so kind of during the pandemic, I became more aware of the wonderful responsibility that we have as artists to use our platform to highlight other collaborators, other creatives from different walks of life, and that I, as the singer, am sort of a vehicle to tell other people's stories. And so, specifically to your question, I became really interested in why in classical music programming in the West, we only tend to hear Western composers. And I thought to myself, I grew up in Hong Kong, I played terribly violin and piano and clarinet and only studied Western composers, and I was living in Asia, and I thought, gosh, I don't even know that I can name so many classical, let's say, Asian heritage composers. And why is that? That the education and what we're exposed to when we go to the concert hall is so Western-centric, because I know there's a lot of great non-Western artistic voices out there. And so sort of what has become a great passion project in my own programming is to find music repertoire, both from living composers and non-living composers, but from underrepresented voices. I've focused quite a lot on Asian heritage, like Chinese diaspora and beyond, because that has a personal resonance for me. I speak sort of smatterings of different Chinese languages. I had some Mandarin growing up in Hong Kong, and my family in Singapore, they speak Hokkien, and of course we had a bit of Cantonese also in Hong Kong. And so, I really love when I'm doing a recital, I might put a Schubert song next to a song by Huang Ruo, who's a dear friend of ours, a Chinese-American composer, or a Chinese folk song, or I've commissioned Central Asian composers, Uyghur pieces, Tatar pieces, and I'm just so interested in how actually similar the narratives are between the repertoire that we already know and love of Western repertoire, these same stories, whether they're love stories or the messages of folk songs, with non-Western repertoire. And we tend to think that there's this, like if we don't know something, there must be this big gulf. There's a reason that we don't know it. Maybe it's not very good, we think, or it's incomprehensible because the language, we don't have a context for that. I've never studied Chinese, so I don't want to go hear Chinese music. Or we tend to have these assumptions about what we think, like how we ascribe quality to something. So I've just been really interested in broadening my own horizons and appreciation of what's out there, and like challenging my own assumptions about stuff. And it's been a great joy and a great privilege to get to know a lot of different composers from different backgrounds and program their music.
We at the HSO very much champion telling stories of voices that have been underrepresented. In fact, we just had, in our last Masterworks performance, the Pacific premiere of our co-commission with composer Huang Ruo, Tipping Point, his Climate Crisis Symphony. Dane, ending the program today is Tchaikovsky's Pathetique, a composer who is very often performed, but a voice in his time that perhaps very much fits the theme of today's program.
Yeah, it's. I mean, Tchaikovsky, when he was writing this piece, his Sixth Symphony, the last piece he ever wrote, in fact, he was really a composer at the height of his powers, outwardly so celebrated, not just in Russia, but all throughout Europe. Yet, in his personal life, he was really struggling. He never had quite settled down. He'd had some abortive relationships. He struggled at a time in 19th century Russia. Tchaikovsky was gay, and it was totally unacceptable in Russia at the time, and he was told to damp down who he was and what he identified with and who he was as a person. And I think it really does come through the music. Now, the story is that, so after this symphony was premiered, 5 days after the premiere, he died. And there have been stories going around for centuries now around how he died. Now, one of the stories is that there was an honor court made up of eminent people from Russian society, Russian arts, Russian literature, Russian culture, who ordered him to take his own life. Now, we're not sure if that's true or not. Some people say he just died of cholera by drinking contaminated water. But what is clear is that there is great turmoil in this symphony, but also great beauty. It's funny, I was sort of thinking on the way here in the car, if you were just to look at this entire program, at face value, you would think, oh, gee, it's kind of morbid, isn't it? But actually, what really pervades this program, I think, is this idea of beauty and this idea that this intense love of life and of beauty in a really true sense, it pervades both the Lieberson and the Tchaikovsky. So in a way, this sort of undertone of mortality that runs through both these pieces illuminates the beauty and the love of life in such a vivid way.
None of us live forever, but there's great beauty in the limited time we have and what we can do in that time to make the world a better place. And that can last forever, as we see with Tchaikovsky. He's given us his last symphony, and we are still performing it today. Music that can speak to the heart and the soul. The last movement is a slow movement. It is not the fast celebratory finale, quite the opposite. But also in the scherzo of the second movement, which is in a very interesting time meter.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like a waltz when you hear it in face value. Ya da 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 dee da dee. 1 2 3 4 5. 1 2 3 4 5. So instead of a waltz, which would be divisible by 3, 1 2 3, 1 2 3, it sort of has a strange, awkward limp to it. It's in 5 in a bar. 1 2 3 4 5. 1 2 3 4 5. But somehow it still maintains this elegance, and I think that's a really important point to make. That Tchaikovsky was a master symphonist, and sometimes we over sentimentalize what he was all about because there was his life outside of music, his extra musical life was so rich with stories, and there are these accretions of tradition that have stuck to his symphonies, particularly the Sixth Symphony, because of the biographical nature, at least the ostensible biographical nature of the work, that we sometimes miss actually what a fine symphony it is in the same lineage as, say, a Beethoven or a Haydn or a Mozart, or later on Mahler or Bruckner, and it is written in such a way that the musical argument unfolds in a really beautiful, organic way. It starts really soft in E minor with just low drones in the basses, and and the bassoon plays a very simple tune. And in the same way that Beethoven would have done this, it evolves over the course of this expansive first movement, and it is just beautiful. It is just beautiful, but it's logical, and there's great craftsmanship behind the artistry.
And starting the program is a work by César Franck, and it is not his Symphony in D minor, which is always so often performed, but a nugget of a symphonic tone poem.
Le Chasseur maudit, the accursed huntsman, which actually I had never known before, and I was chatting to some of the musicians in rehearsal breaks, and most of them had not heard of it before either. But this piece, this little tone poem, it's a nice little 14-minute nugget of excitement and tone painting and colour and story. It was super famous and super top of the pops in the mid-20th century. And it's funny, we think of classical music as this great monolith that's always been, but classical music experiences fashion just the same way that every other realm of art and human endeavour experiences. And so this Chasseur maudit was very famous, and probably in the past 50, 60 years has just sort of fallen out of the repertoire. But the story is very simple and sort of its time in a way. There's a hunter, and he wants to go hunting, but it happens to be Sunday, and he elects to go hunting and not to go to church, which is a big no-no. And so he's out there hunting, and you don't get the sort of horsey rhythm, and over the course of his hunting, he is cursed for not going to church. And so, of course, then some demons show up and drag him to hell. But this all happens in the course of 14 minutes, and it's punchy, it's exciting, it's vivid in its orchestration, and very unlike a lot of other César Franck's works that I know, at least. So it's great to uncover this little gem that I think will speak to a lot of people, even if you don't know the story. So I suppose this program is 2 gems that maybe we've not heard before, and 1 warhorse that we're going to see in a new light, we hope.
And so a perfect program to end the year here in the final month of December, at the end of all things. Maestro Dane Lamb, Fleur Barron, thank you for joining me.
Mahalo.
Thank you. Mahalo.
Today's concert is sponsored by our Conductors Circle sponsors, Mike and Trish O'Neill. The Masterworks title sponsor is the Halekulani Hotel. Today's concert is dedicated in memory of Michael Titterton. I'm Michael Thomas Famai, and this is Concert Conversations at Your Hawaii Symphony Orchestra.